welcome back to another All Things M365 Compliance. I'm Ryan Murphy, Compliance SME at Epic Global and recent MVP. And of course, as always, I'm joined by Nikki. Hi, Nikki.
Hi, thank you, Ryan. So I'm Nikki Chappell. I'm the Principal Cloud Architect at Cloudway and also a Microsoft MVP. And today we're glad to introduce to you Joanne Klein. Over to you, Joanne.
Thanks, Nikki and Ryan. Hi, everybody. I'm Joanne Klein, also an MVP in Microsoft 365 Apps and Services. And I'm here today to talk about a hot topic of late, which is Microsoft Syntex.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Joanne. It means a lot.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. So, Syntex, tell us a little about what it is, Joanne, and what it can do.
It's Microsoft Syntex has morphed over the last few months and years, I would say. It's really a set of apps and services, if you will, to help manage content in the digital modern workplace. I would say using some AI capabilities. And I think the value add of it is the document processing aspect of Syntex. And as we will discover in the next half hour or so, Syntex is much more than just document processing. But if we just hone in on the document processing piece, I think the value proposition for Microsoft Syntex is information workers and knowledge workers can use the capability to build these models. You don't have to be a developer. You don't have to be a data scientist to build these things. People that are familiar with the business process and the document can in fact build these models, which I really think is the strength of the solution and why organizations find it kind of a compelling thing to look at for some of their business processes. So it's, part of a larger family of apps and services for sure within a modern digital workplace, but lots of new capabilities coming in under the broad heading of Microsoft Syntex now.
Okay, sounds good. From your side then, Nikki.
Yes, I think from my side, I really like that we're the ability to empower people, those information workers, rather than always having to go to IT and there's always a backlog for, your requests and you're fighting against somebody else's requirements and things don't happen. So you either go and find manual workarounds or in the worst case, you don't get access to that valuable content. So I think being able to empower those people is great. I think my only concern is have we got those skills within the business? Because I think some of them are a new set of skills for people to learn.
Yeah, I think so. I agree with you. Perhaps we need to kind of elevate those knowledge workers and information workers that are familiar with the process on kind of how you work and build a Syntex model. I have discovered I have a fairly strong SharePoint background. That's where I came from, and it is serving me very well now in the world of Microsoft Syntex in the document processing models. Having knowledge about SharePoint information architecture, what's a content type, what's a piece of metadata, what are the data types you can associate with a piece of metadata. Understanding those kind of fundamental concepts will serve you very well when you go into actually building a model. So perhaps organizations need to start there in, SharePoint information architecture fundamentals. We'll just call it that. This is what is really good to know about. And then go ahead and, since you're already familiar with the business process and what the documents look like, build a model. And, you can build a model with as little as 6 documents. That's not very many documents. 5 positive examples, the way Microsoft words it, of whatever it is you're trying to classify. Let's call it a contract. And then 1 negative example. So not a contract. That's technically all you need. Is more better? Yes, it is. But you can build a model that properly classifies a document with a very few number of documents. That's why you don't need to have hundreds and thousands of documents and a data scientist working on this. It's very attainable for a business information worker to use. But I agree with you, Nikki. There is still some prerequisite knowledge, I would say, that would help you if you're building these models. And there's different types of models as well. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm very new to Syntex. I'll be honest,
Okay.
I know very, very little about it. But when you were
Okay.
talking about it then, Joanne, my mind was going straight to trainable classifiers. When you were talking about, wrapping up those certain types of data structures or document structures and then figuring out, okay, is this relevant to the trainable classifier that I've built? So I assume it takes that type of engine and machine learning and concept to go through those items, to label those items. And the labeling side of it, is that retention, or is that sensitivity labeling, or is that a different type of labeling?
Great question. And I'm glad you brought up trainable classifiers. I'm going to answer this question on a couple of different fronts. Trainable classifier, of course, we all know in the compliance world is a great way to detect content across all of your locations for pre-built models. You can, of course, build your own, but it can apply retention and protection controls on it based on what this document looks like. And I, in fact, use the agreements trainable classifier in my own tenancy to identify, I run my own business in my own tenant to identify statements of work, and it works flawlessly, bang on. The difference between a trainable classifier and building a Syntex model is a Syntex model, A, it's only in SharePoint, A, it's only against document libraries, and it can be different file types, but the value add of a Syntex model is it can set a content type and extract metadata out of the document. A trainable classifier can't do that. So I'm going to give you a practical example. Let's say we have a contract document. Yes, there is a trainable classifier that will identify a contract and could put a sensitivity and label and or a retention label on it. What a Syntex model can do is it can say, oh, I recognize this as a contract based on the 5 or 6 documents you gave me on what a contract looks like. I'm going to set the content type to contract, and based on how you've defined the something called entity extractors in the document, I'm going to pull out the contract start date. I'm going to pull out the customer number. I'm going to pull out the services that's filled in the contract document somewhere. All of that metadata you can pull out and persist as a column inside a SharePoint document library. The reason why that is so powerful is you can then use those, the content type and the metadata in search solutions, in Power Automate Flow. You can trigger workflows that are triggered off something that you've extracted out of that document. Contract start date. Maybe you want to automatically generate an email to the person doing the contract. Let's say once you're 1 week out from the contract start date. You could start to automate so many things once you have metadata extracted from a document. Now, metadata is powerful and it's been around for way longer than Syntex. So all of those good capabilities you have in SharePoint that you can take advantage of because of content types and metadata, you can now do with this automatic extraction. Previously, you were relying on an end user to manually, in some cases, set the content type and the metadata, which is, has proven over the years not to be a reliable method, to be honest with you. Right? It takes time.
Yeah. So for me, I think this is so valuable for that event type retention. So things like a contract where your retention doesn't start until the contract's terminated or the project is finished. You've pulled out all of that metadata, and I'm working with a client at the moment just on that and about how we're going to populate those columns in SharePoint so we can effectively run those queries to say project ABC 1, 2, 3. Has terminated on this date. It's now got a status of completed because you can calculate that based on dates. You can change things, and then you can say, right, because of that, I'm going to now automate my events-based retention.
Yeah, so great example of those two solutions working together beautifully, I think.
Yeah, indeed. My mind's running away with itself at the moment.
Is it? Good.
Information, Joanne. Yeah, for sure. Because we have a customer that's a public sector customer, and they have to have National Archive, documentation, stuff has to be kept for various different lengths of time. And I think using Nikki's example there for the events-based retention, having Syntex there as a platform
Mm-hmm.
to pull that metadata out, to easily target them based on, I guess, you know, if you match these 3 items in a document, it needs to be kept for this amount of time based on an event. If you don't see the third one, then it's not equal to that. It can be kept for a second amount of time.
Yeah.
For me, that's a very, very powerful tool to have, especially when you're in a heavily regulated environment.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about the compliance controls a little bit. You can associate, there's different models, first of all, 3 models basically. And depending on the model, you can they all can set a retention label if a model positively identifies and classifies a document. Okay. And only some of them can also set a sensitivity label based on a positive classification. Alternatively, to your point, you could not set a retention label that way, but you could just set the metadata and then use an auto-apply retention label policy to set the appropriate retention label if it varies on the different metadata values. So there's an example of you can integrate with the compliance controls, but you kind of need to have the broader picture of what kind of compliance control do you want to put on this? Does everything that's positively classified by this model have the same retention requirement? If not, you may want to not set it in the model, but be a little bit more specific on the label policy.
Okay. Just one follow-on question for that, from my own perspective.
Okay.
When you say retention label, does that also support the regulatory label as well, to mark an item as immutable?
I have never tried the regulatory record label in a Syntex model.
We should try that. I'd be interested to see that, because if that would be the case, that would be so much easier, because you're then not relying on the user to remember to that item. If it's a manual item, you can just pull the metadata out of the content of the data and just say, well, I know this is an item that must be marked as immutable.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's worth a test. I've not tested that.
It certainly is. So hopefully I didn't cut you off talking there. Do you want to explain what you were?
No, no, that's good. Yeah.
So I guess the next question for me then, and I suppose for Nikki as well, is what about sensitivity labels? Does it support those?
A couple different ways I can address sensitivity labels. There's 4 model types, essentially 3. So my unstructured document processing model, you can default a sensitivity, or associate, I should say, a sensitivity label with it. All that means is I'm going to run this unstructured document processing model against the library. And any documents that are a positive match, I'm going to automatically assign the sensitivity label to it. Okay. But sensitivity label is not allowed in a couple of the other models, structured document processing and free form. Maybe that's coming in the future, but today that capability is not there. Another way of applying a sensitivity label is with that new license add-on that everybody's been talking about, but it is setting a sensitivity label at a document library level. So it's not related to a Syntex model at all. It's a library setting that defaults everything within, new uploaded content, unlabeled content with that sensitivity label. So it's tangentially related in with compliance, but not associated with the Syntex model. So this goes back to my original point. Syntex is a wide plethora of apps and services, and not all of it has to do with classifying a document. It's a lot of it is the content services that kind of surround that document, as well as the individual classification of it with the Syntex model.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, Nikki, go on.
So I was going to say, regarding language, I know obviously it's been designed with American English. How does it work with other languages, or is it still predominantly looking at English-based words?
No, it works with other languages as well. And there is a great table. Again, it goes back to, it depends on the type of model that you're building. Unstructured, structured, or free form. They support different languages. I think the one that supports the most, if I'm not mistaken, is the unstructured one. So it's, I don't know how many languages there are, but it's certainly more than English.
All
Yes.
right.
Yes.
I wasn't aware of that. That's good to know.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I think just going back to the document library piece,
Yeah.
Nick and I were actually talking about this last week on the February What's New podcast. And we were saying a lot of people had taken probably the blind side view of this may be included in an E5.
Yes.
And started to roll out those document libraries with a default sensitivity label, and are now in a position where they have a number of documents, or even hundreds of document libraries with that applied.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to assume then, if that is a Syntex license and Microsoft start, I don't know, if you're in a position where you've already configured those items within those SharePoint libraries, you're in a bit of a tricky position there, aren't you? Because you either have to adopt the Syntex licenses, which we'll come on to in a minute, is how much they cost.
Yep.
Or you basically go back through, use the AIP super user and remove all the encryption off of them. Now, if you have a lot of items, that's going to take a lot of time. So have you seen that from your perspective also, Joanne, that people have just gone ahead and assumed it's with E5?
Yeah, I've really only worked with one, albeit extremely large customer who, I guess my mistake, I had made the brash assumption that it would be included in an E5 license, which they had. Even though it was in preview, and I know that licensing can change up until GA. So that change, it's I guess concerning for customers that, especially if you've already got E5, that this capability is going to require an add-on license, because I would say it was a relatively easy way to at least get a base level of protection defined on particularly those confidential libraries. So yeah, having conversations with my customers, but I don't really have a good answer for them. You're right. If you want to back away from those settings, and particularly if you've applied encryption with your default label, it's not a trivial undoing.
No, there's certainly an easy way out.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I'm not too sure if you wanted to add anything there, Nikki, from last week's call.
Yeah, I've taken exactly the same viewpoint as Joanne, and I've fed back to Microsoft. Can we have clarification on this? Because I just assumed it was going to be E5. I'm working with a large company. We're just about to roll out the sensitivity labels for groups, teams, and sites. And as part of the provisioning process, we were going to set the appropriate sensitivity label based on the kind of team type. And it was literally just about to launch. And I've just said, hold on, we either remove that functionality in your launch with the container sensitivity labels, and then we go back afterwards, or you've got to put your project on hold. But there is a risk that if you start this and you want to continue, you're going to have to pay additional license fees. So it's, I think it's a shame if it stays that way. I mean, I see it in the similar way where you can have a default retention label on a document library as well.
Yes.
You can see those as equivalent things.
Yeah, that's right.
It's not going to be an easy change. My mind went straight to E5 because most of the automation pieces are E5. I looked at it as if it was an automation piece, and I've basically told a number of customers, hey, this is coming down the line. I know this is what you wanted to do. Luckily, no one's tried it in production yet, but I think they really like it, and it saves so much time for them to have that sensitivity label applied to that default library.
Yeah,
they are not going to be happy if it's under a different license. Luckily, it's not in production. But talking about licenses, there's 3 models of Syntex. Yeah. What does it cost to run Syntex then, Joanne?
You have some options. So we're not talking about the SharePoint Advanced Management License. We're talking about Syntex running these models against a library. Up until very recently, there was one option, and that was a per user per month license to use Syntex. And I think that was $5 USD per user per month. So significant, particularly if you're a large organization. However, well suited, I would say, if you have a relatively small number of users that are working with content that you're running the models against. Because you need a license to be uploading documents into a library where you have one of those Syntex models published. Okay. So not only to build the model, but also to allow the model to classify and extract metadata out of your document. And then depending again on the type of model you're building. So this is one of the key initial decisions you need to make with Syntex is what kind of model are we building? I can talk about that in a moment. But if you're building freeform or structured, you also are consuming AI Builder credits when you're doing that. That's over and above your monthly user cost. So you get 3,500 AI Builder credits every month. It depends, how busy and how many documents you're using if you're going to exceed that or if that's sufficient. So that's today's model up to very recently. In this month, there's now a pay-as-you-go model, which is, I think, really well suited for kind of broad coverage of Syntex models across your environment. If you don't have, large, sorry, I should say kind of more smaller groups of people working with the Syntex models. So think of firm-wide, maybe you want all users to fill out an attestation form every quarter or every year. So it's broad reaching, but an end user only has to do it once or twice, let's say a year. Pay-as-you-go is a very good model for that. So Syntex more broadly used across the environment. So that's the other model, and it's a per page charge. So on unstructured models, it's 10 cents per page that's classified. And there's some pre-built classifiers Microsoft gives you. That's 1 cent per page. Whether that's cheaper or not is kind of on the customer to determine, and you can determine that through Azure subscription. So Azure Cost Management will show you your Syntex consumption. You can monitor that over time, set up alerts, do budgets, all of those typical things you're used to doing inside Azure. You can do, but for the Syntex models running across your environment. So I really like the pay-as-you-go model. I just think it's a little bit friendlier for using Syntex models wherever it makes sense across your environment.
Okay. Okay. That makes sense then. So anything from your side then, Nikki?
No, I think that's quite useful that you've got that. I think the pay as you go. Is there also a trial so people can test this out, maybe do a proof of concept or, to help build a business case for purchase?
There is. In fact, if you go to lookbook.microsoft.com, you can download, or not download, you can set up a Syntex Content Center in your own tenant free of charge. Syntex Content Center is a brand new site template Microsoft has built. It's a SharePoint site collection, and on it is all of the libraries and lists and infrastructure that you need in that site to build your models. This is where you build your unstructured document processing models. So you can use that free of charge. Bring in, if you've kind of identified some processes you think in your organization, this might be well suited for Syntex, try building your model and see if you can set the content type and extract the metadata out of it. It's pretty simple to test that out. But you can't, in fact, publish it to any document library without having one of those license options available to you.
Yeah, of course. Of course. Yeah.
Yes, it's a good way then of seeing whether it suits your needs, whether it can extract the relevant information. That's the thing, is you want to be able to pull out the right information. Yeah.
Yes, that's right. I always say, and this is true whether Syntex is involved or not. I've worked with some companies that have been exceptional at documenting their business processes in workflow diagrams. One company, as a matter of fact, had an extensive list of Visio diagrams that a team was responsible for to document their business processes and keep them up to date. That is really valuable when you're trying to digitalize some of these processes, and which Syntex comes into play then in incorporating where would Syntex make sense in our existing business processes. How is it going to help us? At the end of the day, that's really what you're focused on is, we want to use Syntex presumably because it's going to help the organization in some way become more efficient, save time, reduce risk, whatever the reason is. So, organizations look at your current business processes, look at your information architecture. If you go to aka.ms/ I think it's Syntex assessment tool, you could it's a PNP solution. You can run it against your tenant and you can see where are we currently using custom content types and custom metadata in our environment. Maybe that will highlight, oh my gosh, look at what finance is doing. We had no idea they were doing that. Why don't we bring in a Syntex model to help them out? So those are all kind of ways I would approach using Syntex. And then depending on how the breadth of the solution you're building, one of those two models, I think, may be better suited than the other for how you're trying to use the Syntex service.
This sounds like a very powerful tool after listening to this today. I knew more about Syntex before the call, but if you have, like I say, if you're a government body and you have to keep documents, all types of documents for a certain amount of time, but you just don't know, you've got your retention schedule, but you just don't know where to apply that document to, the retention labels to. You could potentially use Syntex to organize all that documentation based on, like you say, the metadata or the contents of the documents, Joanne.
Yeah.
Not only to refine your document processing, but also to map in your retention and your classification taxonomy on the back.
Yeah.
With ease.
Yeah. It's fantastic. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Nikki.
As I say, so you're building a structured model in an unstructured environment.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it, because I think that is the challenge records managers have, is, like it or not, they need to deal in structure to a degree, and yet everything is unstructured for them across the workplace. So this kind of helps bridge that gap, I believe.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's being a compliance person, that's exactly where my mind went as soon as you started talking. And just to go over the two websites again, it was lookbook.microsoft.com, was it?
I'm just going,
and then the other one was
lookbook.microsoft.com, and I think they still call it SharePoint Syntex in there, but it is the new Microsoft Syntex site template that's free to download. And the other one was aka.ms/Microsoft 365 assessment tool. Right.
Yeah. On Monday, I'm going to be contacting some customers to get onto these two websites, because I really do think they're in a position at the moment where they're going into analysis paralysis by trying to understand what documentation they have, where they have it, what repositories, but more importantly, what content that actually contains.
Yeah.
What contains in that document? How do I recognize that document for what it is and for where it should be kept and what it should be labeled with?
Right.
So this has been very helpful for me, and I'm sure anybody listening or watching, I hope it's been helpful for you also. And I think we're just at time, unless anybody has anything else.
No, I think that's been a really useful overview. I've definitely got one client that I'm working with implementing their records management solution in Microsoft 365. And it's, you know, I can automate as much as I can and put in the content types, the metadata, but it still boils down to having that end user at some point making various decisions where they're going to kind of add that data. Whereas I think with them that Syntex model would really work, because you're kind of removing some of those risks of not capturing the right type of data.
Yes, I agree. Kind of one last piece I think is super important to mention, and I haven't mentioned it, is building a Syntex model is not a once and done activity. That's a really important point to make with your customers and people building these models, because there's a confidence score that comes when a model classifies a document. It'll say, I'm 85% confident I have this right. Maybe you want to take a look at it once it dips down below what? It's up to you to decide, 75%, 70%. It can be maybe the document has changed format a little bit and it can't quite recognize, it's not as confident as it used to be that it's got the right metadata. So somebody needs to administer and be monitoring these models and keep them at a fairly high confidence level over time.
And is there alerting that gives you indication it's dropped below, Joanne?
I'm glad you said that. Another thing you get with Syntex is something called content. I think it's content processing. It's another option in your library. And you can say, when this metadata value changes, so you can do confidence score, that's automatically going to be added to your library. When it dips below 70, send an email to Joe. So absolutely you can do that. Yes.
Amazing. Well, yeah, this has been very insightful to me. Hopefully anybody watching or listening, it's for you as well. Joanne, thank you very much for sparing some time for us today.
It was lovely to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
You're very welcome.
Been a really great session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joanne, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you very much for joining us. Bye for now.
Everyone.
Bye.